that whenever it was finished, that she would be here before she was anyplace else. Although I understand she did something at NCCU last week. I understand you got to take care of home first. In any case, this is the story of the Universal Ethiopian Students Association that work in the diaspora in the interest of Africans, African Americans, and West Indians. And this is a piece that many of you will recognize as missing from the literature in a significant way. In other words, you might find pieces here and there, but she's done the wonderful and difficult work of pulling all those disparate pieces together to give us a coherent story. So we're going to ask you to come up and speak maybe 30, 35 minutes, if the spirit moves you. And if there's anything else that you want to do, we can possibly do that in question and answer. So please help me in welcoming Professor.
Thank you. Good afternoon. It feels so good to be back home. I was a student at North Carolina Central University before coming back to teach, and I spent a lot of time at the Stone Center, and that was my second home, my research home, so it feels good to be back. And so really quick, if you guys can do an exercise with me, can everyone close your eyes? And we're just going to release everything for the day. So close your eyes, focus on your heartbeat, focus on your breath. Breathe in deeply and release. Release your class, release not finding a parking spot, release your midterms, release everything. Take another deep breath in. Breathe in the positivity and let everything out. All right. Welcome again. All right. We have positive energy in the room. I want to do one more thing if it's all right. In tradition, we pour libations and we ask that the ancestors enter into the room and that they bless the presentation, bless the space, because we are discussing ancestors. So I'm going to pour this water in this vase. If you want to call names of the ancestors, by all means. At the end, we'll say Ashe together. All right, so if you have names, please. Marcus Garvey, Amy Jakes Garvey, the Emperor Haile Selassie, to my great-grandparents, to all those known and unknown, we ask that you enter the room and that you bless this talk today. Ashe, 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 and Ashe. So let's get started. First, I'll discuss the methodology of the book. And of course, we're talking about the African diaspora. And so looking at our methodology, it's coming from Dr. Joseph E. Harris, a professor emeritus at Howard University. And he created the field of African diaspora, and he defines it as a triadic relationship linking a dispersed group of people to the homeland, which is Africa. Africa has to be the center of the African diaspora, and to the host and adopted countries. So as he continues to build this field, he starts in the 70s, as he continues to build this field of study, he goes on to explain the pre-modern and the modern diasporas, but most importantly for this work, in a 2001 publication, he coined and defined the term mobilizing diaspora. And he defines it as people with consciousness of the identity of their roots and of their occupational and communicational skills, their social and economic status, and access to the decision-making bodies of the state. So these groups of Africans and descendants at home and in the diaspora mobilize their communities around race and ethnicities for the exertion of political pressure and pioneered the establishment of international organizations for the promotion of African consciousness and solidarity. The leaders who were prohibited from participating in state foreign affairs, they established their own non-state mechanism to conduct foreign affairs in the interest of Africans and their descendants abroad. And the era that we're talking about, the 1920s moving into the 30s, this is the foundation of the African American foreign relations movement that we see in the 1960s with Charles Diggs founding the Congressional Black Congress, and Randall Robinson founding Trans-Africa in 1977. So what makes the UESA, or the Universal Ethiopian Students Association, so important is the building of the movement and the energy, the movement energy that they actually were able to step into. And so building on the movements, we have here Ethiopianism was extremely important. Ethiopia's 1896 defeat of Italy at the Battle of Adwa, it augmented Ethiopianism throughout the diaspora. And historians say that it reached the United States in 1898. But this movement propagated self-pride, determination. It sought to unify the African diaspora, and it looked to Ethiopia as the shining star of Africa because of its sovereignty. Following that, or simultaneously actually, historian Hakeem Adi speaks a lot about the Second International and the coming about of African Americans and Africans throughout the diaspora moving into socialism and communism because of the creation of the Second International in 1889. This is because they're opposing African colonialism. When you partner that with the rise of the Negro question, you have a lot of African Americans, and you'll see a lot of them stationed in Harlem, a lot of African Americans moving into socialism. In my work, I see George Schuyler, who is writing in the newspaper, and W.A. Domingo, who are staunch socialists. Of course, we have Black nationalism. Black nationalism fosters the Black identity, called for group solidarity, self-government, and independence. And then you have organized Pan-Africanism. There were 3 Pan-African conferences that met prior to the UESA's foundation. Their resolutions concentrated on jobs, equality, self-government, and free education. And so this is how they're building on the movement. When we take a step further and look at the current movements that are going on, of course we have Marcus Garvey and the UNIA, the Universal Negro Improvement Association, and the New Negro movement at this time. We're dealing with the 1920s. Both fostered race pride, self-determination, race consciousness among the Black masses and intelligentsia. And this is spread throughout the African diaspora. Specifically, we see the New Negro movement in the English-speaking and Francophone-speaking diaspora. In the French-speaking diaspora, it's called Negritude. And so these are the current movements and the energies that the UESA is feeding off of, and they're able to thrive in, and this is why they are so successful. I'm sorry, that's a picture of Marcus Garvey at the top, and this is a picture of Dr. Alain Locke. He's the one who coined and created the New Negro movement, Howard University professor. So, looking at the UESA was formed in 1927 in Harlem by members of the UNIA's Central Division after Marcus Garvey gets deported in 1926. And their early members are coming in, they create an oath, they buy an apartment in a building, they buy an apartment that they're able to have meetings. They at first started having meetings at people's houses, and that became troublesome. And so they get this apartment, and as they continue to build and get more membership, They, of course, become very successful. I'm going to read a passage from the book. As of August 2nd, 1931, the club had $57.73 in the treasury. A new administration was brought forth in 1932. James L. Brown became president and George Randolph was secretary. During this administration, a reclamation campaign began in September with letters sent to members to renew their membership. In the letter, the club offered a renewal discount to existing student members whose membership had been rescinded. These students could be readmitted to the club as full-fledged members with a payment of $2. The offer was valid for 90 days from the present month, however. The campaign was successful when historian Willis N. Huggins gave $20 for the members' fees, gave $20 donation for the membership fees to activate the students who could not afford their membership dues. The financial records did not report the monies accrued from the reclamation campaign. However, the club did grow. In 1933, they transitioned into an association, now called the Universal Ethiopian Students Association. It enlisted 19 new members. Some were of distinction, like scholar activist Huggins, renowned cricket player Robert L. Chandler, and FISC's first African-American president, Dr. Charles S. Johnson. These distinguished Black intellectuals were of the ilk to elevate the UESA, like the UNIA, in the African diaspora. So as we see, moving into the Depression, we're still seeing this mobilization and the creation of this group. So as we move forward, let's look at the activism that they do in Harlem. In Harlem, and of course this is during the Depression, in Harlem they're hosting mock trials and debates where they're putting European nations on trial for their colonialism and imperialism. They've offered African history courses taught by Dr. Huggins, and this continues their Ethiopianism because they're talking about what we call in the pre-modern diaspora. They're talking about African past, the glorious African past, the African civilizations prior to the slave trade. They published a pamphlet, The Truth About Ethiopia. They organized National Ethiopian Week from December 1st through the 8th in 1936, and this was their large fundraiser. And in so, they were able to donate $5,000 to Emperor Haile Selassie for war efforts in 1936. So this becomes their mobilization in Harlem. They quickly realize that the work that they're doing needs to spread further across the diaspora. So what they do is they create a journal. It's called The Journal of African Affairs. And it's their literary organ, and it began in 1937, and it follows the ideological structure of the Negro World, Marcus Garvey's UNIA newspaper. They sought to use this organ to combat white supremacy propaganda. And so, of course, we have to pay attention to the editors, because the editors are the ones who are going to maintain the journal's level of consciousness and militancy. So first we see David A. Talbot, and he's the editor from October 37 to August 38. The only reason why he sends in his letter of resignation to leave as the editor is because he leaves and repatriates back to Ethiopia to work for Emperor Haile Selassie's Department of Education, which is extremely important. And so once he gets clearance from Emperor Haile Selassie to write back to the journal, he does so to give people a first-hand account of what's going on in Ethiopia, to support Ethiopia, and then, of course, to give a true story of what's going on in the war. Second, we have A. Balfour Linton, May 1943 through 44. And of course, we see this break between 38 and 43. This is because the war efforts, and they weren't able to print, and so they come back in 43. And A. Balfour Linton is the editor. At this time, we see the aesthetic of the journal change. He hires an art editor to come through, and the covers of the African change. They have beautiful pictures on the front. There's cartoons that are throughout the journal, each edition, so that children can learn. And so A. Balfour Linton, coming from Panama, we also see that there's a large influx in Caribbean articles to come through during his editorialship. Next, we have Garveyites R.T. Brown and Samuel A. Hayes. And they heighten the militancy of the journal. And we see that they have articles that are published that are talking about self-determination. They're calling for Africa to rise against colonialism and imperialism. And with this militancy, we see that the journal becomes banned in the Congo. And so the Garveyite editors rise the militancy of the journal. Lastly, we have Akiki K. Nyabungo, and he's an African prince. And of course, during this time, they're talking about post-war efforts in Africa, and we're getting a lot of African articles being published in the journal during this time. And then to kind of give an in-depth analysis or synopsis of this, we have 10 African history installments, and these are coming from the history courses that Willis and Huggins is teaching. We have a demonstration on how foreign control is detrimental to African culture, and this is in a section called African Culture. Of course, they're reporting on the Ethiopian-Italian War from an Ethiopian perspective, and this is something that the UESA has called a lot of the Negro newspapers to the carpet for, because they're not necessarily reporting about the war that's going on and the war efforts that Emperor Haile Selassie has needed. We see a lot of the labor riots in Pretoria, South Africa. And then, of course, towards the end, we're getting Ethiopia's development and Emperor Haile Selassie's struggles with the UN to regain the ancient borders of Eritrea and Somalia. In the United States, we're seeing a lot of the articles discussing labor riots and fair housing, African American participation in World War II. And here you'll see pictures of African American beauties. At this time, the Negro World and the Black Man, both Marcus Garvey's newspapers, are calling for African Americans and Africans throughout the diaspora to take down the white pinup models and to uplift Black beauty. And so during this time, they're showing Black women to be beautiful, Black women being the complementary sphere of the nation and helping out with nation building. And so we see the same thing going on in the African. We have pictures here for an example. And then you also have African American post-war success. And during this, I'm sorry, my apologies. We have post-war success. And during this, we have a lot of articles that are being written about Harlem business owners. They're talking about the beauty shops, the barber shops, the seamstress, and the post-war development that's going on. And in the Caribbean, we're looking at labor riots and the creation of labor unions, the educational achievements, and police brutality on industrial workers. So we also have Amy Jakes Garvey, who is the second wife of Marcus Garvey, to come on to the editorial board in the summer of 1944. And this is a watershed moment because not only does it validate and solidify the UNIA and the UESA working together, but it also allows for Amy Jakes Garvey to spread her Pan-African ideals. So if you will allow, I'll read another passage from the book. The African welcomed Jakes Garvey as an associate contributor in the summer of 1944 to help with their financial struggles. In the June issue, a notice was published alerting readers, starting with the next issue of The African, Miss A. Jakes Garvey will be an associate contributor. Her articles will appear in The African as she is able to send them. Connecting with The African was a watershed moment for Jakes Garvey. Her previous writings focused on gender. This new wave of political writings became her avenue of participating in the stimulating Pan-African dialogue that blossomed during and after World War II. As she continued to make connections for the UESA and the African with her UNIA subscribers, now that The African was widely distributed, Jakes Garvey provided her editorial expertise. She advised the editorial staff to put two staples to hold the magazine together. One is not enough. Try to get issues out regularly as finances permit, and do not lessen the high tone and cultural outlook of the magazine. In her Pan-African fervor, Jakes Garvey implemented a pen pal section. She realized after the 5th Pan-African Conference that most Africans at home and abroad knew little about the rest of the African world. She believed that such an exchange of views, information, and ideas is one of the best means of creating fellowship and love between Africans at home and abroad. And I felt that that was extremely important because Amy Jakes Garvey was the editor of The Negro World, so she has the expertise. But when I read the letters that she told the editors to put the two staples and make sure that the height and cultural tone is always present, I kind of interpreted that as like the mother hen, like the boss lady. She's telling them, you know, aside from using her expertise, what to do and how to make the journal successful. So, and this is a picture of Amy Jakes Garvey. All right, so in closing, the Mobilized Diaspora is one of the new directions in the field of the African diaspora, and the UESA is one of the many early organizations that mobilized in the diaspora against colonialism and imperialism. And so my question to you is, how will you contribute to the Mobilized Diaspora? Thank you. We'll go ahead and open the floor for question and answer. If you have any questions.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
And I'm interested in pan-nationalism in general. Just one question I asked is that around that time there were a lot of African American intellectuals who were experts in international affairs, and they work at the UN, and they later on also contribute to the independent African countries. So is this group connected to the other group around Howard and other places who are also thinking about the new world order?
Yes, yes, absolutely. We have Hansberry, Leo Hansberry, who is at Howard University at the time. Willis Huggins was the liaison between Friends of Ethiopia and the group, also working at Columbia University and having connections at Howard University. So yes, in the book I list the groups that Joseph Harris talks about, what you're referring to, but he leaves out the UESA for some reason. And so I was able to uncover their papers, and so this book definitely adds them to that list that Hansberry is dealing with at the time. Thank you.
Well, I have a popular culture question, but wouldn't Ethiopia should be the Wakanda?
Oh, should Ethiopia be the Wakanda?
Yeah, I think in the 20s and 30s, if they had the movie, Ethiopia would be the Wakanda.
It definitely would, and that's the reason why we have an entire movement, Ethiopianism. We see here in the name of the organization, everyone is using the term Ethiopian, connecting with Ethiopia because of their sovereignty, because of the defeat against Italy at the Battle of Adwa. So yes, it would definitely be the Wakanda, I guess, to popular culture. Yes, sir.
Yeah, can I ask you that after the second invasion of Ethiopia by Italy, do you talk about the recruitment of African Americans to go and fight in Ethiopia against the Italians?
I don't necessarily talk about, I do talk about the recruitment and the call that Emperor Haile Selassie gives out, but not necessarily the soldiers. I'm definitely dealing with the Department of Education. A lot of people are following David Talbot over, and also the Department of Recreation. We have a lot of members to go over, and this kind of piggybacks on Joseph Harris's work that he does, African Americans in Ethiopia, the 3,000 that he writes on. There are some additional names in my work that Dr. Harris doesn't mention, but not necessarily the soldiers, because Dr. Harris does an amazing job with talking about the soldiers that go over, so I deal with the intellectuals. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you for the presentation. It's very interesting. Actually, it's very timely too.
Yes.
I have a question. Why Ethiopia? I mean, is it explaining your book why Ethiopia was so important? Was the symbolism of Adwa? Why is it? Because as you know, as you saw, the Battle of Adwa is very important because it's the first time a white power was defeated by a black power. Not only that, Ethiopia didn't have all the armament the West had. So it's very important to elaborate on that because we have a lot of young, people, and I don't think they know much about Adwa at all because now it's going to be the 123rd anniversary of the Battle of Adwa, which is coming up in March 1st.
Yes, definitely. The Battle of Adwa was a watershed moment, like you're saying, especially looking at the history of the African diaspora, moving from that pre-modern to the modern diaspora. And like you mentioned, that was the first time that, when we're looking at the rise of colonialism and the rise of imperialism, that a European nation was defeated. And this makes it extremely important. This becomes then like I said, the shining star of the entire African diaspora because of this defeat. We have other African countries that have been taken over. And so for Ethiopia to stand and rise and not be colonized at the time was extremely important. And this then, like I was mentioning, the term Ethiopianism, the connection, the identifying with the country becomes very prevalent. And we see that even in the name of this organization. There's several other organizations that take on the name Ethiopia, making that connection, and creating that sovereignty with the country. Yes, ma'am. And I do go into depth in the book. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
Yes, first of all, thank you for your lecture. It's quite in-depth. I want to know, this seems like such a far span from what many public schools, even at the collegiate level, even private institutions, even begin to scratch the surface of the global identity of people of color. Why this subject for you? Because obviously you're very passionate about it. So how did you start this journey to end up, majoring in this, and a doctor in this, and writing a book about it?
Wow. Do we have time? Well, I'm originally from Kentucky, and I grew up with my great-grandparents. And They were born in 1913 and 1915, and they knew their great-grandparents. And during Thanksgivings and Christmas, we would all get together and sit at the feet of the elders, and they would tell us stories about their great-grandparents being enslaved. And so I always knew that there was an African connection. I always knew that something was there. And shameless plug, when I came to college at North Carolina Central University, the late great Dr. Sylvia M. Jacobs was there teaching African history. And she asked all of us in the class, "Where are you from?" And of course my first answer was Kentucky. She said, "No, where are you really from?" And I said, "I don't know. Like, I'm only from Kentucky." And she said, "No." And she proceeded to make us do our genealogy. And from there, I was able to call my great-grandparents and say, "Guess what I found?" And I started learning more about myself the more I learned African history. And if any of you all have ever, if you know someone who knows Dr. Jacobs, then you know her teaching style is impeccable. And from there, I was just able to fall in love with African history. When I got to Howard University, I went to study with a specific professor, and he passed away the year that I got there. And I walked into Dr. Keto Swan's office and begged him to take me on as a student, and he is African Diaspora. And of course he asked me 50 million questions to see if I was ready, and I guess I passed his test because he took me on as his first PhD student in the African Diaspora. But having that African history background coming from North Carolina Central was amazing. And so from there I was able to meet Dr. Harris, Joseph Harris, who I refer to so much in the book. I met Dr. Harris, and of course he asked me 50 million questions to see if I knew what I was supposed to know, and he gave me the thumbs up. And I told him, I said, "I'm going to continue your work." And he said, "Thank you, because I'm tired. It's time for the next generation to do so." And so I've been blessed to get the okay from Dr. Harris, to get the okay from Dr. Keto Swan, and of course to get the okay from Dr. Jordan. Thank you. No. To be here with you all today. So this is how I got into the field. Being nurtured by the founder, Dr. Harris, has been an amazing, uplifting journey. But I have to give credit to my great-grandparents who introduced me to who I was at such a young age. Thank you.
Follow that question again. I want to go back to the recruitment issue, and I'm going to ask you two questions. One, if William Scott's book, The Sons of Sheba's Race, figured any into your understanding, and I'm wondering because the construct that you used is primarily diaspora, which is very easy to see. But I'm wondering if that particular element of it, and even the element of UESA, speaks more to the Pan-African notion, because diaspora at that time wasn't being used, right? It wasn't being used as a way of understanding where black people were in the world. So Garvey's Pan-Africanism is in many ways and in many places the way that African Americans mobilized, and one of the first times in the history of Pan-Africanism that one group went to fight in the war and to die in another country outside of the Spanish Civil War. But in terms of the black world, that was the first period. So I'm wondering how those two constructs, how Pan-Africanism and diaspora, fit together in the analysis you made.
Okay, perfect. How Pan-Africanism and African diaspora fit together. Actually, they're one and the same, like you mentioned, and this is how I explain in the book when I'm dealing with the previous movements. And I use a lot of Hakeem Adi's work. I did read Scott's work, but I use, because it's a more recent writing, Pan-Africanism in the African Diaspora. I think it was published in 2002, maybe. Don't quote me on that, because I'm not quite sure. Okay. It's been a while since I've taken comps, so don't quote me on the date. But it was a more recent work, and then of course having the connection with Hakeem Adi, actually knowing him, being able to contact him to kind of flush out my questions. I used his work more to talk about how they were one and the same, Pan-Africanism and the African diaspora. As you mentioned, the African diaspora is a current term. The field is current. It's in its infancy stage. So you're right, Garvey's Pan-Africanism, I used the Pan-African conferences, the Pan-African Congress, organized Pan-Africanism to set the stage to discuss how the diaspora is being performed at that time. And so like you're saying, and something that I will be discussing at Asala coming up, how then Harlem, New York is entered into the African diaspora because the third Pan-African Conference is in Harlem in 27, the year that the UESA is founded. And looking at what Dr. Harris calls the Western loci, right, of the Black intelligentsia that's already mobilizing in the diaspora, which is Pan-Africanism. And so we're making these connections. We're actually saying the same thing, but using different terms, different language. So I would encourage students to stay abreast of the reading so that you know when terms change. But like you're saying, the Pan-Africanism is diasporic.
One of the things that I want to emphasize is that it's a big step to say I identify with somebody who lives someplace, and another step to put on a uniform and take up arms and go and fight in someone else's war. The next time that takes place, it's almost 24 years later when Cubans go to fight in the Congo. So those are really the first two salvos in making Pan-Africanism visible and material. And I'm always interested in how scholars like yourself look at what has to take place inside a person's heart to go fight for a place where they were not necessarily born, but have been proselytized to understand it's part of who they are.
It's part of who you are, right? And when we are looking later for the Emperor Haile Selassie's call to come over, there are several articles that are published in the African that I discussed, several articles where he's saying, come home. You know, come home to fight, come and fight. And then he's making reference of what James Weldon Johnson calls the Red Summer of 1919 and say, well, you already know what happened to African Americans who fought in the First World War. You see the results of it. If you're not happy, come home, we can make a change. There is hope. So you're absolutely right. Try not to give too much of the book away, but I'm sorry. It's exciting, and I think you're being modest about how much time you put into this, and some of those really important little nuggets. In some cases, you have scholars who believe a lot of that just started recently, and it's been there for a very long time. Of course, and like you said, we have to look at how we build on the movement. That's why I put that slide in. How we build on the movement and what energies are already out there prior to the UESA being founded in 27. Thank you.
Okay, if not, please help me to thank
Thank you.
Yes. So there are books available here for those who want to come up and get one and have it signed by our guests. This is, as you can imagine, for me, a very, very interesting subject
because in many ways we're not really aware of how many of that first generation of African leaders came to the U.S., came to African American communities and said, shut up complaining and then come home. If you have all these problems, just stop complaining and come help us build an independent Africa. And a lot of them did. A lot of them went and never came back. So hopefully at some point we can just do something around that here. That would be interesting. All right, for those of you who took time to come, thank you so much for coming out. We really appreciate your having these kind of engagement with us. The next one is Sharif.
Strange Food screening on the 10th, and then we have
The next book talk I met.
Herman Bennett on the 2nd of April.
All right. All right, thank you very much. And thanks once again, Bull's Head, 10 years as a partner doing these book talks. Really, really been successful for us, and we thank you again for the partnership. We're going to bring you here to the table to do a sign.
Are you going back to that?
Oh, yeah.
I'm sorry.
I can help you bring this.
Yeah, if you can just along with the evaluation. I think you will beat me to the office. Just put them on my chair in my office, and I'll take care of it when I get there.